In fashion's fairy tale, McKinsey and Company plays the role of villain, the one that holds the crystal ball. And love them or hate them, their report on the state of fashion, in conjunction with the business of fashion, continues to be the prophecy that the entire fashion industry follows. And I'm so happy that 1 year later, I'm able to do this again to break down their report for 2025 to see what they predicted, what actually happened, and yet again see how, like the villain in most fairy tales, their prophecy was actually right. So if you've never heard of this, or you're just new to this side of fashion, which I am also still learning about, the business of fashion and McKinsey and Company had come together about 10 years ago to put out this annual report called the State of Fashion for X year. For this year, we're doing the 2025 version. And really what it is, it's an annual report which is somewhat of a cheat sheet for the industry. So McKinsey and Company is one of, if not the top research and consulting firm in the world, and they really go out into multiple different industries, but for the sake of this video, we're talking about the fashion industry, and they do a lot of research, observation, gathering intel from previous, from current, and from policies that are expected to be enacted in the future, and they curate a report, or they condense it rather into a report for the relevant parties and players in the fashion industry to use accordingly, as mentioned, as a forecast to guide them in terms of what they're supposed to do in their respective portions of the fashion industry to make sure that they are profitable, that their businesses will thrive. The report itself is pretty lengthy, but we can always go through bullet points, a generalization, just to see if what they predicted actually came to light. There's a portion of this report that is deemed the executive summary, and the overarching theme for the state of fashion for 2025 is the title of this executive summary, which is Challenges at Every Turn. And I found the first two paragraphs to just be so jarring and a very accurate overshadowing of what really happened. So it states, though hard to predict even in the best of times, the fashion industry is in for a particularly tumultuous and uncertain 2025. A long-feared cyclical slowdown has arrived. So if you remember for 2024, there was some uncertainty there, but now for sure they knew it was going to be a slowdown. There's definitely going to be a slow in growth of the industry. And when you think of fashion or just any business related industry, it is all about growth. It's growth in profits, it's growth in innovations, it's just growth in general. And we were definitely sure that there was going to be a slow in growth for 2025's fashion. And then the next sentence goes on to really just summarize why this happened. And they start with the consumers and how there's just like a low confidence in the fashion industry, especially the luxury sector of the fashion industry. They've been scarred by high inflationary prices, low quality, the rise in dupes that are of similar quality to items that have insensitively high prices. And then, of course, they also mentioned the geopolitical aspects, the introduction of tariffs, the back and forth with politics in terms of that. And that again leads into pricing and distribution of products that will ultimately affect the consumer's outlook on fashion and whether or not this will drive them towards actually purchasing fashion or purchasing into whatever services or products that the industry is putting out. Specific to the luxury section of the fashion industry, this is where essentially in fairy tale land, the giants have fallen. The post-pandemic gold streak, where everyone who had saved up all their coins because they had nothing else to do with them, they were bomb rushing the luxury stores. There were queues outside Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Hermes. That has definitely kind of slowed down. There are definitely queues at designer stores, but not to pay full price. We're looking back at the Rose sample sale, yet another year of people standing in line for hours on end trying to cop a designer fashion, but at discounted prices. We're no longer seeing people flocking to these designer stores to film, to get all these expensive items to pay full price. We're not seeing that anymore. Therefore, some titans in the industry, especially those under the high-end conglomerate portfolios like the LVMH, who had to produce their reports because they're publicly traded companies, they have reported significant falls in profits for 2025, especially in the earlier months. And it's not that people weren't buying these items at all. They were just buying them at a much slower pace than these businesses had hoped that people would be purchasing them. So when they had put everything behind driving these brands, driving productions, driving marketing, people were not biting. Consumers were no longer biting. They were turning their interests elsewhere. So now where were these people turning? This was also something that was in the report that we saw come to life. They were turning to the underdogs. Mid-range brands were having their moment this year in 2025. And for sure, I myself have even had to put out a video talking about mid-range brands because that's where I do most of my shopping from. And that That's where people were finding more value. They no longer saw the value in having exorbitantly, inflatedly priced luxury items when they could get the same quality, better quality at more accessible prices for things that they are more likely to use that would be of more value to their lives. Think of Zara, H&M, Massimo Dutti, COS, Coach. These were the brands that were having their moments, and we learned more and more about other mid-range or mid-luxury brands that were offering just what the consumer needs: high quality, expensive looking items at accessible prices. Another prediction that was actually fulfilled was that secondhand now became first choice. Secondhand fashion, vintage fashion, pre-loved fashion was the first choice for most people. Even I pointed it out in this video that I made on the resurgence of vintage fashion or vintage-like fashion, where people are looking for this sense of nostalgia. They're looking for more accessible pricing. They're looking to still have designer labels, but they just want to be able to afford them. And there was very much evidence, concrete evidence, in the increase in profits of secondhand or consignment resellers like The RealReal, ThredUp. I live in New York City. I work in New York City. I shop in New York City. And I can't tell you how many times I've turned a corner and there is yet another vintage pop-up. There's yet another vintage market. There are tons of consignment stores on every corner. And I've seen this more this year than any other year since I've been here. And it just goes to show that this is where people are heading towards. This is where the profits were. And not only were we seeing growth and profitability with these types of stores or sellers, but the high-end luxe brands definitely took note of this prediction in the report, because we saw a few of them leaning into selling their very own pre-loved items or upcycling items from the past, or creating new items that looked like they were already worn, that were patinaed, that were vintage. And then there was a quiet revolution of the adoption of technology and AI. This was more on the industry side and less so the consumer side, even though I think it's going to start trickling over to us as consumers more for 2026. But this is all about utilizing the advanced innovations in technology and artificial intelligence to be more efficient, to be more profitable. So utilizing AI for trend forecasting, for sorting, for inventory, for pricing. And I think it's going to trickle down to us as consumers in a way that it would be beneficial to the companies as well as to us as a consumer, where we're going to utilize artificial intelligence in the same way we're using it now, like ChatGPT, etc. We are going to use these AI to be more conversational, a little bit more personable, and to help us in the process of shopping. And that is definitely something we're going to see in 2026, and I look forward to it. So McKinsey predicted that the winners for the year, even in this period of slow growth, were going to be those brands or those players in the industry who could differentiate themselves, who could be able to produce something that's going to make them stand out even within their particular sector of the industry. So for the design houses, we saw them change their creative directors, and that definitely put the spotlight on each design house. It created at least attention going in their direction. And that couldn't have been more of a better prediction. This year's fashion season was so much more exciting than any other we've seen in the last, I want to say, like 2-3 years, because of just the shuffling of creative directors or this newness that they brought to each high-end luxe house. There's also the shifting target for the market that these brands are targeting, or just stepping into different sectors within luxury. Those fashion houses are stepping into hospitality. They're stepping into small luxuries, refineries, art. Just differentiating yourself is definitely what was predicted to be able to put you as a business on top. And we definitely saw that. Think of all the brands that really stood out in your mind for this year and think of what they had done. And you will see that in some way, shape, or form, they definitely differentiated themselves from the rest of the pack. So one thing I would say that they predicted that they didn't necessarily get wrong. I think the players in the fashion industry actually followed their lead on this one, but it just didn't take on the consumer side, is that of mostly targeted the silver generation, the 55 years and older, or at least trying to create this multi-generational appeal where brands would just cater to everyone. I genuinely think it did not really happen on the consumer side, because the influentials of fashion, at least in the public sphere, was still Generation Z and probably a little bit of the millennials. The older generation, I don't think, really cared that much about this type of fashion, or at least putting it out there publicly. So I don't think it translated well. And even though, as someone who still reads magazines in print and online, I saw where they were trying to gear towards this. I saw the arrow going towards that target, but it just did not hit the target. It missed a little bit. I think we are going to see it more in probably 2026. It might take, because that generation, the silver generation, has the most income. So the expectation is that they will be willing to spend it, but at least for 2025, they really didn't. Another thing that McKinsey predicted, or at least encouraged, was for these retailers to incentivize their workers to drive satisfaction of customer and the customer experience overall. And I actually think that's one of the reasons why there was a rise in mid-level or mid-luxury mid-range brands and the interest there versus the decline in luxury. Yes, it has a lot to do with availability or access to funds to actually purchase these things. But if you remember, when luxury fashion really took off, especially on social media, majority of the desire and the appeal to shop luxury, to shop in these stores, was based on the blogs we were seeing from people who back then were just content creators who eventually became influencers. They were living in the lap of luxury. They were being waited on hand and feet by these sales associates. They were building relationships with these sales associates. And so by the time the post-pandemic gold streak, as we mentioned before, kind of came around, people were expecting the same, and it was just not there with these high-end luxury brands, at least not for all. They're trying now to go back to that, but it was just gone through the window. But for mid-range brands, mid-luxury brands, or even fast fashion brands, they really focused on the customer experience. And in the report, they pointed out brands like Aritzia, Uniqlo, and I shop with those brands very often. And when I tell you the customer experience is top notch, it is so much better than in some of these high-end luxury stores. And for the brands that really came out on top, those in the mid-luxury or mid-tier range, they definitely heeded this recommendation from McKinsey and the business of fashion. Yeah, so love them or hate them, McKinsey and Company continues to hold the crystal ball and the prophecy of the future in their hands, especially when it comes to the fashion industry. They were spot on the money, on the ball for 2025. Below your thoughts and what you're hoping to see in the fashion industry in the future. Until my next video, stay fashionably well and in good health.